thank you all for coming out. Thank you for supporting the Story County GOP. Brett and Jeff, thank you for your leadership in the county. I especially want to thank the dinner committee. I got here a little early today when this room was pretty empty, and they worked very hard to pull off an excellent dinner, so let's give them all a round of applause as well. Thank you. And I want to thank all of the great legislators you have here, Rob and Dave and Jesse, and thanks all to the local and county officials and to the candidates as well, like Kara and James and Nico. It's tough to put your name on the ballot sometimes, but we need good Republicans, and I'm sure that you're going to win this fall, and you're going to inspire a lot more good Republicans to run in the next election as well. And, you know, most important, I just want to thank all of you who have been loyal, hardworking Republicans for many years. Many of you in Iowa, like in Arkansas until not too long ago, seemingly toiling in the vineyards without producing a lot of fruit. But you see the fruits of your labor by the great elected representatives you have in the state capitol and in the United States Congress. You're the backbone of the Republican Party. You perform the most important mission we have, which is to elect Republicans to every office from city council to the White House, because the American people count on us to protect our nation and to protect our way of life. That's what Americans depend on the Republican Party to do, and the Republican Party in Iowa has done a great job of that. You've sent two of the very best United States senators to Washington, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, and I know you're going to send Chuck Grassley back later this year. And I can tell you, between Randy and Ashley and Marinette, y'all have a great group of freshman congressmen who have taken the Capitol by storm. And once Zach Nunn sends Cindy Axne packing, you're going to have an entirely Republican congressional delegation. And that's what we need, because the path to a majority in Washington, in the House and the Senate, runs straight through Iowa. We cannot have a majority in the United States House or the United States Senate without all three of your representatives reelected and Zach Nunn in Washington and Chuck Grassley reelected. And Lord knows we need them because of all of the failures of the Biden Democrats. There's so many failures, we have to set up jars to have boats on them at your dinners. And there's not enough jars for them either. I mean, Joe Biden didn't just cause the nation's problems, he has no solutions for them. Zero. Oh, maybe I should be fair. He does have some solutions, I think. He knows that inflation is hurting working families and that prices are going up. He just doesn't understand why all of you can't have your son make some finger paintings and sell them to a bunch of rich Democrats for $500,000. Or, you know, crime is, as Randy said, crime is rising all across America, unfortunately. It's rising especially high in Democratic-run cities like Washington, D.C. But Joe Biden did tell me recently that he's helped stop crime in Washington, at least on the White House grounds and in the White House itself. And I said, really, stop crime in the White House? How'd you do that? He said, we took money laundering and corruption and drug dealing to zero. I said, how did you do that? He said, I told Hunter Biden to get out. But seriously, people, Joe Biden and the Democrats in Washington have no solutions because they are the problem. And that's why the American people turn to the Republican Party to protect them, to protect our country, and to protect our way of life. And I would talk to you a little bit tonight about what we're protecting and what it means and how we do it. You know, we just celebrated the 4th of July, and I know a lot of you probably marched in 4th of July parades for that. Or you celebrated the 4th of July with your kids, and that's what I did with my kids. And it's a little hard sometimes. They're 7 and 5 to get them focused on the true meaning of the 4th of July. It's frankly a little hard to get them to focus on the true meaning of Christmas when the presents are under the tree. But on Sunday night, I was reading a kid's book about the Declaration to my 7-year-old. And, you know, we read about the French and Indian War and all the tax acts that came after that and the rebellion and the Declaration. And he was really into it. He's into war stories. And he said, Daddy, when you were in the Army, did you serve with George Washington? And it's like, I'm not quite that old, son. He's like, oh, yeah, right. You served in Vietnam. And And I said, no, son, that was Grandpa Lynn that served in Vietnam. He's like, oh, yeah, you were in Iraq. He's like, yeah, that's right, son, I was in Iraq. And we continued to read about the Declaration and about the war for independence and what the fight for freedom meant to our founding fathers. And then he said, Daddy, do they celebrate the 4th of July in England? And I said, no, son, they're still pretty sore about that. He said, well, what are they going to do tomorrow then, Dad? I said, well, they're going to go to work tomorrow because it's just another day. But here, we're celebrating our birthday, which is a strange thing for a country to have. Not many countries have birthdays. Certainly not many great countries have birthdays. But we do, because we were born, as Abraham Lincoln said, conceived in liberty, dedicated to that proposition that all men are created equal. And I'm very proud of my sons that the next day, for the first time, after 6 tries with my 7-year-old and 4 tries with my 5-year-old, I got them to sit through an entire reading of the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't easy. Thank you. Give them a round of applause. It wasn't easy. They interrupted a lot. There were a lot of words in that old document they didn't understand. Daddy, what's a usurpation? Daddy, what's quartering of troops? But there's one word that the 7-year-old did understand. When they got to the end, and they got to the closing sentence, and it said that with a firm reliance on divine providence, we mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And he turned and he looked at me and he said, the last word is honor. I said, yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it, son? He said, yeah, it is. I said, son, 56 men signed that document. Think about what they were doing. They were rebelling against the mightiest nation on earth. And some of them lost their lives. And a lot of them lost their fortunes. Not a single one of them betrayed their honor or their country. And we owe it to them and every generation that came since then to hand down to you and the generations after you the same blessings of liberty that they gave to us because they were willing to stand up and fight for it. That's what this holiday is about. That's what this country is about. That's what our founding fathers did. And we're having a dinner tonight in honor of one of our great founding fathers who brought great honor and credit to this country. It's pretty cool to have a county named after Joseph Story. I think you may be the only one in the country. You know, in Arkansas, we got a Washington, we have a Jefferson, we have a Jackson, we even have a Lincoln and a Grant, 2 great Republican presidents. I think you may be the only Story County in America. But Joseph Story was a great man and a great jurist. He wrote those 3 volumes, he said, out of his reverential attachment to our Constitution. 3 volumes on our Constitution. I got to tell you, a lot of the people I work with couldn't even read 3 volumes, much less write them. And frankly, a lot of the Democrats haven't even read the Constitution if you look at their ideas. But as we heard in the biography that Jeff read about Joseph Story, maybe his finest moment came at the end of his life in the famous Amistad case that was popularized in a movie by that name. A group of Africans who had been impressed into slavery on a Spanish slave ship and rebelled, and they came into America's jurisdiction, and Spain wanted them back. And Spain was a mighty empire that threatened the United States still. And John Quincy Adams, after he'd been a great diplomat, after he'd been a Secretary of State, after he'd been a president and lost, after he'd gone back to the House of Representatives, took up their case. These humble Africans who had no connection to our country. And he argued that case up to the Supreme Court, and Joseph Story sat on that bench, and he heard the case, and he wrote the opinion, and he said, we will respect their rights just as much as we respect the rights of all mankind. That's the promise of America here at home, and that's what we've always promised all of mankind, is to be that beacon of freedom, to protect the rights of all mankind and the rule of law, whether you are an emperor across the seas, whether you are someone who's been impressed into slavery. It's a great moment for Joseph Story and a great moment for our country. You ought to be proud to live in a county that's named after such a great founding father. I'm proud to be here with you tonight. And I'm also proud to continue Joseph Story's work, because protecting our rights and preserving our freedom for our kids and their kids is not just the work of judges, it's the work of every American. Not just the work of elected officials like me or Randy or state legislators, it's the work of all of you, of tens of millions of hard-working Americans who love this country and are willing to take the time to plan the dinners, to organize the committees, to knock on the doors, to make the phone calls, to sacrifice and give money to people who need it to run races. You can see the fruits of those labors as well, and not just see them in electing Republicans to the Congress or to your legislature or to county government. The same kind of work and energy that Randy described is why we have a constitutional majority on our Supreme Court that just a couple weeks ago reversed the historic tragedy of Roe v. Wade after 49 years of misguided jurisprudence. And in the same way that Joseph Story took a stand for those rights, Donald Trump, with very much the help of Chuck Grassley, leading the Judiciary Committee, and Republican senators, helped confirm 3 of those 6 justices who believe that the Constitution means what it says, and the Constitution should be understood as our founding fathers wrote it, not what a bunch of liberals wish it said. That's what it means to protect our rights. But again, Lord knows there's a lot more that we have to protect. You just look around you and you see the harms that Joe Biden's Democratic Party is inflicting on America. You're all living with it every single day, with the cost of gas and groceries and everything else you buy. This is not an accident. It didn't just happen. It's not bad luck that Joe Biden came to office at the wrong time. They did this. This was part of their plan. This was their design. This is what they said they would do. Joe Biden said when he campaigned for office that he was going to end fossil fuels. Barack Obama's energy secretary said we need gas to cost as much as it does in Europe, which is about $8 to $10. They're not there yet, but they're going for it. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez want to eliminate all fossil fuels, every bit of it, for cars and trucks and tractors and electricity in just 10 years. They first said that 2 years ago, so now maybe it's just 8 years. Think about how bad they've made things already. Think about how bad it would be if they stayed in power. I just heard from a grocer a few days ago who said that sales of hot dog buns and hamburger buns were down in his store. Sales of white bread was up. Why is that? Because so many families are stretched so thin at the end of the month that when they think about a cookout for the 4th of July, they don't pay $3 for 8 hot dog buns. They just make do with white bread. Families have to make those kind of decisions every single day because the Democrats intentionally inflicted this energy crisis on us. And the inflation you see is not just at the pump, it's everywhere because of this energy crisis. Because everything you're eating and everything you're wearing and everything your kids are playing with, it was made with energy, it got to you with energy, and it was maintained with energy. And they've intentionally waged a war on America's energy sector. They did this on purpose, and they'll keep doing it. Just look what their solution is when you see this inflation. Is it to say we got it wrong, we made a mistake? Do they go to North Dakota and Texas and say, hey, can you pump some more oil? That would help us? No. Joe Biden goes begging to Iran and Venezuela for more oil. Looks down his nose at America's roughnecks and coal miners. Well, he and all of his liberal buddies ignore the Chinese slave labor that's used to make their solar panels, or the African child labor that's used to make the minerals that go into those solar panels. Joe Biden will not protect this country from the devastation he has wrought on families' budgets. He's the reason we're paying $5 a gallon for gas. He's the reason people can't afford groceries. Yet he won't take responsibility for it. He blames everyone but himself. He blames Donald Trump's tariffs on China. We had tariffs a lot earlier than we had inflation, though. He blames Putin's price hike. We had inflation much earlier than we had Vladimir Putin's war of aggression on Ukraine, though. Joe Biden is to blame for this. But now, what is he going to do to try to solve his political problems? There have been reports recently that he's going to lift the tariffs on China. even though they didn't cause the inflation, even though we didn't have inflation for years with those tariffs in place. Why? Because he doesn't have any other answers, and he's panicked and he's desperate. Those tariffs were designed to give us leverage over China and to pressure them to buy more of the commodities you make here in Iowa or that we make in Arkansas. And more fundamentally, they were designed to force China to stop cheating and lying and stealing as they have been for 30 years. But Joe Biden's going to give it all away for nothing in return because he wants a political lifeline. What he should be doing is standing up to China and acknowledging what he refuses to even say is happening, that China is waging a Cold War against the United States. He explicitly says we're not in a Cold War. What he doesn't get is it's not our decision. If another country is waging a Cold War against you, you don't have a choice whether it's happening or not. You only have a choice whether we win it or lose it. And Joe Biden will lose to China because he is not tough enough to stand up to the Chinese communists. Joe Biden doesn't even think they're a real threat. He spent years, decades as a senator and a vice president celebrating China's rise, saying that a rising China was good for China and good for America, toasting Xi Jinping, the communist dictator of China, whenever he'd go to Beijing or Xi would come to Washington. Just on the campaign trail for president, when everybody knew what China had been doing. He said that China is not a competitor of ours. He said they're not bad folks. Whenever China unleashed a plague on the world that devastated our economy and has killed thousands of Americans, he still won't take the steps necessary to hold them accountable. Joe Biden will not protect America from communist China. Republicans have to. Otherwise, we will lose the Cold War that we're in against China. Joe Biden isn't tough enough to protect us against any threats we face. I mean, look at our southern border. Again, it's a crisis that's caused by the Biden Democrats. This is not an accident. It's not a mishap. It's not an unintended consequence. This is what they promised in the campaign. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both said that they would decriminalize illegal immigration. They haven't quite taken that step because Congress wouldn't do that, but they have done it in effect. 2 million illegal aliens have entered our country in just 18 months with Joe Biden as president, adding to the 20 million already here. Joe Biden and the Democrats claim they're fleeing persecution in Central America. Well, Central America has a lot of countries that are less violent than Democratic-run cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Baltimore. Can't be that bad there. But I've been to the border. I've seen hundreds of migrants huddled under those bridges. I've talked to them. I've asked them, why? How did you get here? Why did you come? Not a single one of them said they were facing persecution because they're a woman, or because they're a Christian, or because they're in the political opposition party back home. Every one of them said, because I could get in, because Joe Biden, because I wanted a job. Why do you think those caravans wear shirts that say, Biden, let me in? Because that's the message they broadcast throughout the campaign, and that's the policies they pursued for the first 18 months of their administration. And it's not just a matter of border security, it's a matter of national security. We've lost more than 100,000 of our fellow citizens each of the last few years to overdoses. Almost all of those drugs come from cartels in Mexico. Our communities have faced terrible illegal immigrant crimes, as happened to Molly Tibbetts here in Iowa. The cartels are responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths every year in America. Cartels are responsible for more deaths, in fact, each year in America than we lost in the entire Vietnam War over 20 years. And Joe Biden has no plan to protect America from the drugs and the violence of those cartels. Let me just make one suggestion. Ask yourself, what would we do if Al-Qaeda or ISIS set up shop in Monterey or Juarez or Tijuana? And whatever you think that is, that's exactly what we should do to the cartels until they are destroyed, until our border is closed, and we have protected the American people from the crime, the drugs coming across that border. And finally, and most fundamentally, Americans expect us to protect their rights and to protect their freedom. The purpose of our free government, after all, is the freedom of our people. It's not the power and the authority of petty little bureaucrats like Tony Fauci. It's the freedom of our people, the freedom to worship your God and speak your mind and raise your kids and earn your living without the leave of government. Only Republicans will protect those freedoms. Look at what the Democrats do. They invent rights found nowhere in the Constitution, like the right to an abortion. Yet they refuse to defend rights that are explicitly protected in the Constitution, like your right to keep and bear arms. Thank goodness that we have that constitutional majority on the Supreme Court, which just struck down New York's gun-grabbing law a couple weeks ago, saying that you as an American citizen have a right to carry a firearm to protect yourself and protect your families, and you don't need a special reason or special permission from the government. The reason you get to do that is because you're a free American. And the American people expect Republicans to protect those rights. And not just from government, frankly. They expect us to protect their rights from all of these left-wing corporations and big tech companies that are being used as, in effect, an adjunct arm of the government to suppress your speech or to police your conduct outside the workplace or to interfere with our elections, to condemn our legislatures for reflecting the conservative views of our people. The American people expect and need us to protect their freedom. I know these things are a lot to ask. I know it's a tall order, and I know it seems like things are going in the wrong direction right now in America, and they are. But things are going in a pretty bad direction in the Carter era as well. I don't see anyone around here old enough to have been there. Maybe one or two. But look what all it took to turn it around was one big election with Ronald Reagan and a new Republican Senate. Now, maybe we're in a deeper hole right now than we were in 1979 and 1980. Joe Biden used to run around last year talking about how he was going to be the next FDR. I bet most of you, like me, would just be happy if he could claw his way back to only being as bad as Jimmy Carter. But the American people expect us to protect them, and to do that, we have to keep working hard and to win this next election here in Iowa and all across the country. And I'll just leave you with one final story about a question I get a lot about my time in the Army. Really, I got it when I was in the Army as well from my civilian friends. They would ask, why does the flag fly in reverse on the soldier's uniform on the right shoulder? And it does. It flies with the blue field forward. And I said, well, the answer is very simple. In the old days, when cavalry was horse-mounted and they'd mount cavalry charges and colors would go with the soldiers, if you were on the right side of the formation, the flag would appear in reverse. And that's why still today, long since we got rid of almost all the horses that we have in the Army, the flag flies in reverse on the soldier's uniform. It's a reminder to all of our enemies and a reassurance to all of our friends that our Army never retreats. It always advances. And at a time when America is under assault and our way of life is under attack, I think that's a pretty good lesson for all of us Republicans. We will never retreat. We will never surrender. We will never back down. We will never quit in the defense and protection of this great nation. Thank you all. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Of Senator Cotton. So if you have questions, we'll have you shoot your hands up and Jeff will bring you a microphone. But to kind of get started, I can ask a couple. Will you guys think of some so we can get moving on them. So, Senator, with your military background and armed or national security intelligence experience in the Senate, obviously we hear you mentioned Putin's price hike and what's going on in Europe. So, for people who say let's take care of things at home, why does Ukraine matter to what's going on in the U.S.?
Yeah, so first, I'd like to back up first and say how we got in the mess that Ukraine is in right now. We got there in no small part because of Joe Biden's weakness and his lack of leadership. From the moment Joe Biden took office, he signaled to Vladimir Putin that America would appease and conciliate him. He gave him concessions on the only arms control treaty we have left with Russia with nothing in return. He gave him concessions on that pipeline that we had sanctioned in the Trump administration with nothing in return. He gave him a big fancy summit in Europe with nothing in return. And then, of course, there was the debacle in Afghanistan last August. And it was only a few weeks later that Putin began to mass troops on Ukraine's border after he saw what Joe Biden was made of in Afghanistan. And it continued. He kept telling Vladimir Putin, he still does it to this day in some ways, like what he wouldn't do, as opposed to letting Putin worry about what we might do, which is always Ronald Reagan's approach in Afghanistan, in Nicaragua, in Grenada, in Libya, in Iran, and so forth. And then once Putin invaded, he was very nervous, like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, about what kind of weapons we're going to provide to Ukraine, and would it be viewed as offensive or defensive. My view is always pretty simple. If Russia invaded Ukraine and Ukraine was defending its territory, then every weapon they had was, by definition, defensive. All that said, because of the bravery and skill of the Ukrainian army, and in many cases the Ukrainian people, and the leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky, they stopped the lightning invasion designed to decapitate the government. The war in Ukraine has shifted to the east. It's a pretty grinding war of inches. Russia has made some gains right now, but Ukraine is now getting a lot of the advanced weapon systems like mobile artillery and long-range artillery into the country. I think we need to back Ukraine to the hilt, in part because it's right in the heart of Europe where we have a lot of interests, but also in part because the Chinese communists are watching us. And if Xi Jinping sees the United States or Europe falter and flag here, then he's going to think that he can get away with anything in Taiwan. And I'm afraid that if the course doesn't change sometime in the next few years, then Xi will invade Taiwan. And that would be a huge disaster for America, much worse than what you see in Europe right now. Taiwan has always been a beachhead and lodgment of freedom on Chinese soil. It's a direct rebuke to the Chinese communists. The Chinese people are not capable of governing themselves. Geographically, it forms part of what's called the first island chain, from the Alaska Aleutians to Japan, to Taiwan, to Philippines, which gives us a huge naval advantage because it keeps the Chinese Navy somewhat behind a set of friendly territory. More recently, there's a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. They make the most advanced semiconductors in the world in Taiwan. Our economy is dependent on those chips. If you've had troubles in the last couple of years getting a tractor or a truck or advanced piece of equipment because of chip shortages, imagine what it would be like if China controlled the world's supply of the most advanced semiconductor chips. So we have to think not just about what's happening in Ukraine itself, but also the kind of lessons that we may be teaching other enemies around the world, much like in the 1930s when Germany and Italy and Japan continued to invade smaller countries, weaker countries, and no one drew a line, despite people like Winston Churchill saying we had to. And inevitably, you got to the point where they were invading countries that we were allied with and ended up invading our own country in Pearl Harbor.
Another question would be, obviously, Roe v. Wade and that decision with the Supreme Court is fresh on everybody's mind. We have a very pro-life audience here. And Randy hit on it a little bit, but, you go on social media and people act like abortion is now banned across the country and it's over and the fight's over, but obviously it's not. So maybe talk about, what you see for the future of the pro-life movement and where we go from here.
Well, again, Roe v. Wade was a historic mistake. For 190 years, the American people had debated this question among themselves and settled it through their elected representatives. That's where we're back to now. And that means that states like yours and states like mine, a lot of other states will be able to protect unborn life. I think a lot of states are still finding their footing about how they're going to approach that. I think in Washington, it's best we let that process play out. I also just don't think it's a practical matter that either party will have 60 votes anytime soon to pass significant abortion legislation. So I think you'll see this debate occurring primarily in our state houses. Sometimes there are inevitable issues that touch upon what we do in Washington, like the Democrats' efforts to repeal the so-called Hyde Amendment, going back more than 40 years. The Hyde Amendment has prohibited your tax dollars to go to funding abortion. Democrats have tried to repeal it now twice. We've stopped them. We're going to stop them again this year. Democrats have talked about allowing Department of Defense or VA hospitals to begin performing abortions, especially in states that restrict abortions. Obviously, we're not going to allow that to happen either. You've even seen some far left Democrats in the Congress suggest that we start using federal land as if you're going to open up abortion clinics and federal parks in states that regulate it. We're obviously not going to allow that to happen. But I think just as a traditional matter, since this debate was traditionally belonged to the states, and as a practical matter, since I don't see 60 votes anytime soon on either side of the question, then I think you'll see most of the legislation happening in our state capitals as it's happened in yours and happened in mine.
Very good. Okay, questions from the audience now that you've had some time to think.
I have a question. I don't know if this is fake news or real news, but they're saying China's buying up a lot of our land.
Real news.
It is real?
Real news, and it should stop. Because not just in China either, China or in the United States either. China has been buying up millions and millions of acres of fertile farmland all across the world, to include in places like Ukraine. And that's because China cannot feed itself. This is another point I would say, that we have had leaders in Washington, sometimes they've been Republicans as well, who have not appreciated the fact that China has been waging a Cold War against us for decades. China cannot feed itself. It cannot process its own food. We, by contrast, are the world's breadbasket. Why would we give up that advantage? Why would we give up that huge advantage on one of the most basic staples of life? We shouldn't. China should not be buying our farmland. They shouldn't be buying our food processors or companies.
So Biden continues to shoot us in our own feet. Can you talk about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Is it true that he is, obviously he's selling it off, and we're down way low, and some of it has gone to China? If that's correct, how critical of a mistake is that?
It's true, and it's a terrible mistake. So the reports you've seen this week are true, that that the United States, and some of the recent releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has sold that oil to other nations, to include China, which, as with food, cannot fuel itself. It is heavily dependent on oil and gas imports. Why would we ever allow them to buy our oil? For that matter, why would we ever try to abandon our own oil production and buy a bunch of solar panels and other so-called green energy from China, since they've cornered the market on that in many respects through their economic theft and espionage and cheating and stealing? But to get back to a more fundamental point about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, it is a strategic reserve. It's not a political reserve. Joe Biden should not be releasing oil from that reserve because gas prices are too high. He should reverse his own dumb policies that made gas prices too high. So when we created that strategic reserve in the aftermath of some of the oil embargoes in the 1970s, we had that in mind. Now, thankfully, we're not nearly as dependent on foreign oil anymore as we once were, although if the Democrats had their way, we would be again. But there are other reasons for that as well. If, for instance, you had a major hurricane that hit some of our refineries and other processing facilities in the Gulf Coast, if you had a war that broke out, that's why we have that reserve of oil. And it's going to be costly to replenish it as well, because a lot of that oil, most of that oil, went into the reserve at times when oil was nowhere near $100 a barrel like it has been for many months because of Joe Biden's dumb policy. So it is true, but it reflects a deeper mistake that is done solely to protect Joe Biden's political interests, not to defend our national interest.
Okay, we have time for another question.
Senator, what do we do about the EPA, USDA that are taking off and making their own laws for us to follow and just doing it independently without you guys making the laws?
Well, I'd say most immediately, next time you see Chuck Grassley, give him a big hug and thank him for those 3 new Supreme Court justices. This is the way our system is supposed to work in part. If the American people want something and they want it long enough and deeply enough, they'll get it. That's the way our Constitution works. You know, we don't have a popular plebiscite system where you just conduct public policy by polls. And the fact that the American people wanted to drag the needle across the record, so to speak, in 2016 by electing Donald Trump, the fact that they twice sent a Republican majority to the Senate in 2016 and 2018, knowing in 2016 that one of those seats was at stake, suggests that they were tired of liberal judges in Washington and all across our country telling us what to do. So I know the gun case and the Dobbs case got a lot of attention in the last 2 weeks, and they deserve to because they're very important cases. The EPA case from a couple weeks ago may be as important, though. This is the case in which the Supreme Court told the EPA, who wanted to regulate all of American energy sources in a sweeping regulation, not just come in and say, well, that plant has a little bit too many emissions, or this plant is a little old and it needs upgrades. No, they wanted to regulate all of American energy. And the court said, you can't go find in these dusty little corners of laws that are 50 and 60 years old these vast, sweeping new powers. If Congress had intended to give you that power, Congress would have said you had that power. So as an immediate matter, that case and some other cases like her coming along, I think are going to clip the wings of some of these bureaucrats in Washington. But once we take charge, a couple more things we can do is, one, use our oversight power to shine some sunlight on what's been happening at the EPA or the USDA, or for that matter in the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland, sicking feds on parents going to school boards because they don't like their kids being taught to hate America, or their 5-year-olds having to wear masks in kindergarten. At the same time, he's allowing left-wing mobs to protest outside the homes of Supreme Court justices in direct violation of federal law. So there'll be a lot of oversight coming in January. And then second, we'll use our spending power also to limit what these bureaucrats can do. We did it very effectively once I was elected to the Senate along with Joni Ernst in 2014, even before Barack Obama left office those first 2 years, but especially in the Trump era, we were able to rein in a lot of these bureaucrats by putting limits on what they can do with the money that they get each year.
Senator, I have this idea that these alphabet agencies, they all seem to, the power goes to their head. And I think one of the things that Congress ought to seriously consider is lopping off the tops of these agencies, every single one of them. FBI, DOJ, FDA, all these agencies, lop off the managers, get rid of them, and use that as a warning shot to the ones that are left. It's like, no, this is the way we wrote it. Follow what we said. What are your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of these career permanent bureaucrats who have let the power go to their head. I mean, Tony Fauci is the very best example of it. No one elected Tony Fauci to do anything. Tony Fauci can give advice. He's an expert, I guess, in epidemiology. But you know what that makes him also? That means he's not an expert in childhood development or small business management or supply chains or anything else. No one elected Tony Fauci or elected the bureaucrats at some of the agencies we've discussed. They elected me and Randy and the rest of your senators and congressmen to make those decisions. Another thing we could do maybe, we started this a little bit in the Trump administration, is to send these bureaucrats away from Washington and out closer to the people that they're trying to regulate. Maybe some of these USDA agencies would see things a little bit differently if they lived in Iowa and Arkansas. We did that some in the Trump administration. Moved some of the public lands agencies out west in the states where they own 80 or 90% of the land and presume to dictate to people how they can use those lands. Just a couple ideas of how we might rein in these bureaucrats.
Senator Cotton, I'm a baby boomer, and to reach those, what are they called, the Gen Z or the 20-year-olds, how are we getting them to realize that the social climate that we're in is wrong and get those principles back instilled in them?
Well, Joe Biden's doing a pretty good job of that with the effects of his governance. I would say that, in part, life is conservative, right? I bet a lot of you were probably a little more to the left of where you are now when you were in your teens or your 20s or your 30s. But you get out of school, you get a job, you start a family, you have kids, you get a mortgage. Those are all inherently conservative actions. Winston Churchill, who himself shifted a few times on the political spectrum, but that was only because the party shifted around him. he said, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're old, you have no head. And I think as some of the people who probably voted for Joe Biden in 2020 see the results of this disastrous first year and a half of the Biden administration, they're having second thoughts and buyer's remorse. And they're going to vote for Republicans this fall. And it's our job to keep on persuading them and working to get them to the polls and make sure they do.
Okay, one last question.
Both my parents came from a socialist country, so there's nothing I fear more than socialism. But I think it'd be very easy to reverse that trend, either reduce it or eliminate socialism in our country. But for example, like privatizing Social Security or eliminating income tax with a fair tax, or replace it with a fair tax. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, socialism is the goal of a lot of the Democrats. It's an open goal. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the rest of the so-called squad and these far-left Democrats, they actually believe that America should be a socialist nation. That's one reason why we've succeeded over the last couple elections with winning a greater percentage of Latino voters. Because a lot of those voters or their parents immigrated from countries that were socialist, like Venezuela, like Cuba, or that had much more statist economies, unlike the United States. Now, I support Social Security. People have worked hard for a lifetime and paid into Social Security should have those funds available for them in their retirement. Our income taxes are too high. Frankly, all of our taxes are too high. So I support reducing taxes where we can, especially taxes on working families who are struggling with rising costs in America to make ends meet, to get their kids in school and put food on the table and find someone to watch them while they're working. So there are things that we can do to return more money and therefore more freedom to working families. But what we can never do is allow our nation to become a socialist nation. So thank you all. God bless you. God bless the United States. I appreciate you coming out tonight.